Good morning. It's great to see you here, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this masterclass. For those of you that I haven't met already, I am Kjersti Fluttum, Chair of the Holberg Board. The masterclass is an event where we work to create a space for exchange and dialogue between the Holberg Prize Laureate and PhD students from the Nordic countries. We also would like to involve the audience in this exchange, and you will have an opportunity to contribute later on. Today, we have with us the 2023 Holberg Laureate, Joan Martinez-Alier, who is Professor Emeritus at Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona in the Department of Economics and Economic History. In recommending Martinez-Alier for the Holberg Prize, the Holberg Committee notes that he is a world-leading scholar of ecological economics, political ecology, and environmental justice. His transdisciplinary research integrates social and natural sciences, proposing a humanities-driven form of economics. Martinez-Alier is highly influential in several fields. These range from anthropology, geography, environmental studies, and political economy to agrarian studies, and also the analysis of food systems. He's a major figure and leading public intellectual in the Bergen movement for degrowth and agroecology. Analytically clear, his critiques of mainstream economic theory raise questions about the dominant focus on economic growth as the sole metric of a good economy. His approach rejects economic models based on extracting resources from the environment to support material accumulation and consumption. Instead, his economic framework centers on human and environmentally flourishing development, creating an alternative, pluralistic theory of value for determining economic judgments. The empirical basis of his theory draws on extensive and long-term research conducted in a variety of global contexts. And based on participatory research methods, his analysis emerges from dialogue with indigenous and non-Western forms of life and knowledge. A central concern of Martinez-Alier's work is how environmental questions are inseparable from analysis of historical injustices and ongoing inequalities. These injustices raise questions concerning the ecological debt that so-called developed nations owe formerly colonized countries. Two of his most influential books are Ecological Economics, Energy, Environment and Society, with Klaus Schlippmann from 1987, and the Environmentalism of the Poor, a study of ecological conflicts and valuation from 2002. Martinez-Alier is a founding member of the International Society for Ecological Economics. He also founded the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. The Institute is a multidisciplinary center promoting the study of the nature and causes of environmental problems and seeks constructive policies that enable transition to a sustainable economy. A key part of the Institute's work is the Environmental Justice Atlas that documents environmental justice struggles around the world. And Martinez-Alier has the unusual distinction of both anticipating and actively engaging with the interrelated planetary challenges of poverty, climate change, and food security. His innovative theories and mentorship continue to build the capacity of new scholars and policymakers to address this intersecting crisis of global economic life. And now, on stage in a few minutes, Joan Martinez-Alier will be joined by 4 PhD candidates. We are sorry that the 5th PhD candidate had to withdraw very recently because of illness. But here, today, the first participant is Laima Nomeikaite, who is PhD candidate in Cultural Studies at Roskilde University in Denmark, and the University of Southeastern Norway. In recent years, she has worked on a variety of projects related to culture, heritage research, and urban planning. She is particularly interested in the linkages between heritage, arts, political ecology, and place. Then we have with us Liisa Jokivirta from Political Science at the University of Jyväskylä, Finland. Liisa is a doctoral researcher, educator, and environmental and indigenous rights activist. Her PhD is centered around constructing an indigenous political ecology framework for mapping out environmental conflicts and resistance movements on the Finnish side of the Sami indigenous homeland. Our third participant is Elin Valsdottir from the discipline of anthropology at the University of Iceland. And Valsdottir's PhD project investigates the recent mining boom in Greenland and its social, political, and environmental implications. Here, the interplay between climate change, mining, and the opening of the Arctic is examined to shed light on the multifaceted nature of mining operations in Greenland, as well as the stakeholders involved and affected by its development. Our fourth participant is Shayan Shokosar, who is a PhD candidate at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation, the SET Center, here at the University of Bergen. And their research investigates the implication of solar energy transitions and cognate aspects, and agro-pastoralist and the modern human in Rajasthan, India. Joining Professor Martinez-Alier on stage is also Ksenia Hanacek. She is a political ecologist and a Margarita Salas postdoctoral fellow at Global Development Studies, University of Helsinki, and Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. Her research focuses on environmental conflicts due to extractivist and big infrastructure projects in the Arctic. Now, given that the theme of the masterclass is precisely about political ecology in the Arctic, Hanacek's expertise will be very important to the discussion here. I think we should give all our participants a round of applause now. So, this is an event that is in large parts in the hands of the Holberg Laureate, as well as the invited PhD candidates. What will happen now is this. The Holberg Prize Laureate, Joan Martinez-Alier, will provide us with an introduction to the theme he has chosen for this masterclass. And the theme is no less than, how can the study of social metabolism in ecological economics and industrial ecology lead to political ecology through the Arctic region? Thereafter, the PhD candidates will provide a short introduction to the research projects before a more general discussion on the theme is opened. And this will be led by Professor Martinez-Alier. Towards the end of the masterclass, we will open the floor for a more general Q&A session, and Academic Director Bjørn Inge Bertelsen, sitting here, will moderate this final part. And with this, I would now like to give the floor to Joan Martinez-Alier. Please.
Right. Thank you very much for this occasion now to hold a master class. Of course, I am very much used to give classes and to have seminars, little seminars like this, but not in this good and very splendid theater like this. And I know that there are other people who are listening outside the room, and therefore we should get going. And I will speak some words of introduction, and then I think that the main protagonists of the session are going to be the doctoral students who are here. And then we are supposed they are going to speak to explain to us briefly what they are doing. And then I am supposed with Ksenia to speak some words of wisdom. No, which I don't know what it means, but it means no critique, but rather encouragement, isn't it, for what you do. When they asked me, the Holberg Prize Committee, to say what the Masterclass was going to be about, I decided to propose this, the political ecology of the Arctic, hoping also to explain what we do in Barcelona and in other places with the environmental justice aulas. And Senia Hanasek has been very active working on the Arctic environmental conflict cases, and myself also, and to try to show our knowledge, or our ignorance rather, about this, and to get some feedback from the audience, not even perhaps now in this session, but also in future exchanges that we will have. Why the Arctic? Just because we're here, or near. I mean, the Arctic starts a bit north from here, and not because we have a special knowledge of it in the group in Barcelona, but we are covering the whole world with the environmental justice aulas, and then I read what I wrote for this meeting. The Arctic region can be seen as a growing and changing commodity extraction frontier. I know it's much more than this, and geologically, biologically, ethnographically, politically, isn't it? But I look at this from this point of view. The Arctic region can be seen as a growing and changing commodity extraction frontier. The whole Arctic, which is here, there is a map about it. And, well, the candidates, the PhD candidates will remember, or will learn in this session, that the world industrial economy is not circular, but it is entropic, meaning that we take stuff from the earth, fossil fuels or minerals and so on, and this cannot be recycled. Therefore, this explains why next year other companies come, or the governments perhaps, come to the limits of the earth, like here, and they take new supplies of gas, oil, coal, for instance, from Dixon going to India, and so on. And also minerals, more and more minerals, and we are going to have at least one of you is going to explain what is happening, for instance, in Greenland, which is a new frontier for extraction, isn't it, of ilmenite or rare earths and so on. So we have a lot in common with some of your projects. We will remember concepts of social metabolism, concepts such as ecological distribution conflicts, which I don't know whether you use it in your thesis, but you don't have to, because this is not an exam at all, but you could try whether they're useful for you. And then valuation languages. So if I had to run the whole class, which is not the case, because you are going to be the protagonist and we stop talking in about 3 or 4 more minutes, we might start, if you look at the map here, from, for instance, what I would do if I had to do a toxic tour of the Arctic. It would take quite a few weeks. But I would start in the Lofoten Islands in Norway, for instance, because there has been a decision to leave the oil and the gas in the sea, as I understand it. And then I would look at the conflicts on wind energy, the frozen wind energy conflict in Norway, but also in Sweden there are wind energy conflicts. And then there are, of course, metal mining conflicts in Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Sarkati mine, and many in Russia, isn't it? With nickel and with copper and with other new palladium, for instance. All these are in our ALDAs. These are cases in the ALDAs, in which you see there are some selected cases for a chapter of the book that I showed yesterday. I am preparing, but there are many more. They are not all here in the map, no? Of these ecological distribution conflicts, largely explained by the extractive industries. Then once we're in Russia, really, this is a big place. We'll continue with oil and gas extraction in the Numtor reserve in Siberia already. Then the Yamal and Gidan peninsulas that we had yesterday, something about it from Senia, and Total Energy is there, and Novatek and other companies. And they have become well known because of the Ukrainian crisis stopping the gas pipelines. And then we will go further to the east of Siberia and Russia and the Kamchatka Peninsula and so on, but we are not going to do this today. And then we will cross the Strait of Bering and go to the Alaska, where, as you know, President Biden has given up on the prohibition of extracting oil from the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, and he's going to allow this. And this is a big issue in the US for many reasons, including reasons which are common to the reasons in Russia or here about oil and gas, which have to do with local populations and also with climate change at world level. Then we, in Canada, we would, if I had the time now, isn't it, which I don't have, and it's not foreseen that I take more time that I am allowed to speak. In Canada, there are many conflicts, and one which I could say I like, but I mean, they are very nasty conflicts, but which I find very intriguing is in Baffin Island, which is really Greenland, in iron mining. When I'm talking about oil, gas, now iron mining, copper, I am talking about millions of tons of materials, millions of barrels of oil every day from Norway. 1 million barrels of oil means 50 million tons per year. So look at this. You divide this by 5 million people in Norway, and it means like a lot, like 20 tons per person per year, something like this. And it's not only oil and gas, it's also the mining metals. If we take into account everything that mining metals imply, a lot of waste, isn't it? Which remains tailings that remain there. So once we are in Canada, we could also look at Yellowstone mining with arsenic and so on. And then we could go to Greenland and with rare earths, ilmenite, as I said, and then we could go to Iceland, as one of you are from Iceland, isn't it? Well, you know about Iceland. I don't know really about Iceland, although I have visited Iceland, and it's not so large in population at least. So, and there is conflicts on hydropower, which become political conflicts, isn't it? Hydropower for refining bauxite, or for using bauxite to produce aluminium for export, because Iceland doesn't need so much aluminium, isn't it? With Alcoa and other. So that's, I find very interesting what happened in Iceland. And so that's what I would do in my toxic tour. And the two main points are, again, that the Arctic can be seen as a commodity extraction frontier. Of course, it's very different from, say, from the Andes for copper extraction, isn't it? Which is like a corridor. Here's is a different thing. And also, as a hypothesis, we could say that there is a transversal environmental justice movement across the Arctic, mainly based on indigenous identities and claims. But this I'm doing something which I think that teachers should do sometimes, is to propose new ideas, because the students quite often know more than the teachers. And therefore, proposing this kind of hypothesis, I hope to get some, if it is useful for this class, to get some reaction from you. Is the Arctic, can we see the Arctic across the whole region as an environmental, as a commodity extraction frontier that has given a social reality or political reality of an environmental justice movement based mainly, but not only, on indigenous identities and claims. Thank you very much. And now
Thank you. Yes.
you take over.
I take over.
Yes.
And then it's back to you. Thank you for that, Professor Joan Martinez-Alier. I think you provided a pretty clear ground for us to discuss. And also, I'm happy that you referred to Norway's involvement in being part of this frontier. I think this is good. Is the microphone okay? More or less. It's great to see you all here. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I'm the academic director of the Holberg Prize. As Kjersti Fløttum, the chair of the Holberg board, also underlined, in this masterclass, we work to create a space for exchange and especially dialogue between the Holberg Prize Laureate and PhD students from the Nordic countries, also involving the audience later on. And words of wisdom being words of encouragement. I like that, Joan. So without further ado, let us get started. And our first speaker today is Laima Nomeikaita. Apologies for the pronunciation. It's very good, thank you. She's a PhD candidate in cultural studies at Roskilde University in Denmark and the University of Southeastern Norway. So please, Laima.
Yeah, thank you a lot. Thank you a lot for the opportunity given me. It's such an honor. And my PhD focus on street art, heritage, and modern representational approaches. And this talk is influenced on my current research on street art or arts. And here I would like to discuss the importance of arts and artistic practices in addressing the questions of environmental policies and political ecology. So basically I will concentrate on two cases. One is my personal story of leading an environmental political festival, Feast Against Hunger, or in Norwegian, Mathilde mot hungersnød. He is here in Bergen, since I lived here for 13 years, and I was engaging actively in culture scenes here. And another case, since the topic is about Arctic, I will concentrate about Street Art Festival, Fest, up in the north in Vardø town. French philosopher Guattari, he has argued that discussion of ecology is not only a matter of human, but also different registers of ecological thought and actions, such as the environmental, social, cultural, and political. In this presentation, I argue that artworks can be important political ecology actors, or they act as support for actions, for human actions. This was at least the case for me and my friends while arranging the festival of Mathilde mot hungersnød from 2012 to 2015. So Mathilde mot hungersnød, Feast Against Hunger, was a national project against food waste. In Norway, close to 1,000 tons of food is thrown away every day, and globally 1/3 of produced food is wasted. At the same time, 1 billion people today suffer from chronic starvation. The festival attempts to eliminate this paradox and find a solution. So we collect the food, which is up to close to the expiry date, and we gathered the teams, and we collected, we created, we made new food, and we brought to Nygårdsparken, which is just close here. And this food, the waste food, became a good food, and this, afterwards we or people donated money, which we gave it to, we collaborate with Norwegian Church Art and Red Cross, and we donate money for Somalia, Sudan, Mali, Syria. So we try to shape the mentality of food waste and environmental policies from different art events and interventions. The festival had arranged environmental panels, dance, redesign, art exhibitions, and activities for kids, and all these activities focus on reuse and environmental concerns. The festival has also collaborated with Street Art Collective, BART, and Street Art Collective painted together with the kids waste containers, and in this way, the containers were invited to reuse better. In this way, Mathilde was both environmental, culture, and social community building event. The other art art-based political project which I want to address is Comma Fest in Varde. And Varde was traditionally a vibrant fishing community. However, due to global restriction, the town lost half a population during 1960s and 2000. So Comma Fest was arranged by Norwegian street artist Pøbel in a collaboration with the Varange Museum. So Comma Fest played the notion how to the house being reused from sleep by activity. So 12 international artists, they painted on declined buildings a different sentence, such as, "Cold is great, fish belongs to people, everything is the story." In this way, we try to raise the environmental concern. The Comma Fest project has showed that arts and street art can provide new perspective and contribute to transformative ways of exploring, challenging, and understanding existing environmental, heritage, and urban policies, as well as creating new knowledges and experiences. In both cases of Feast Against Hunger Festival and Comma Fest, artworks did not resolve all the environmental and social political problems. But artwork showed to be an important political ecology actors for environmental activism, physical, culture, and sociopolitical transformation. They are important supporters for human actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laima. I'm sure we'll come back to the importance of art and political action later on. Our next speaker we have with us is Liisa Jokivirta from the Political Science Department at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okta, gratitude. So I would like to start by thanking the Holberg Week organizers for this invitation. And I'd also like to begin by expressing my appreciation for you, Professor Martinez-Alier. You have an almost Nordic-style humility about you, but I assure you that you continue to inspire many scholars and activists alike, including myself, so olugihtu. Guakte, the politics of deep listening. I start this masterclass by pondering what kind of a political ecology are we actually committed to as we discuss political ecology in the Arctic as a vastly diverse and ontologically pluralistic region. Whose epistemologies, languages, concepts, methodologies, governance structures, land conceptualizations, place names, and cosmologies do we choose to center? And which do we, perhaps for lack of time or research funding, sometimes neglect? It has been argued that the danger of so-called mainstream political ecology is to take dominant categories for granted and thereby risk perpetuating the very coloniality that we seek to deconstruct and challenge. Conversely, I ask myself, what might be the practical implications of an indigenous or decolonizing political ecology that, as its very starting point, seeks to amplify alternative relational orderings? I first situate myself and my research in the spirit of indigenous and decolonizing methodologies. So I'm a Finnish-Canadian educator and researcher of political science and indigenous studies, and my doctoral work has largely centered around mapping some of the environmental conflicts on the Finnish side of Sapmi, even though these resistance movements very much cross current colonial state borders. Much of my fieldwork has been based in Otsiohka, the northernmost municipality and the only remaining municipality in Finland with a Sami population, which is the majority. Otsiohka, much like Sapmi, is often portrayed as a barren, untouched landscape in the popular imaginary. Meanwhile, like in many other indigenous languages, there's no word for wilderness in northern Sami. There is only merchi, land defined in relation to human use, with identity and cultural survival grounded deeply in paikki, or place. Narratives of the economic value of the land as resources to be managed, controlled, or exploited are often in daily life contrasted with pluralistic, relational ontologies, where the land is alive with ancestral and social meanings. I never understood this until I lived for years in Sapmi. This is not to romanticize or idealize Indigenous knowledges, but all too often, Indigenous ontologies are only explored within so-called Western framings, seen but not really heard. When was the last time that any one of us here attended an all-Indigenous climate panel? Golma, Ednu Edni. Since Professor Martinez-Alier's Environmentalism of the Poor, scholars have started to sketch what might distinguish Indigenous political ecology as a decolonizing research approach. And if time allows, I would love to share some of the Indigenous mapping processes that I've seen in some of the cases where I have had the honor to do field work, including a mining case that was actually withdrawn. Nelia, giving back. If human-induced environmental destruction is a political, economic, and ecological problem, it is also a deeply epistemological and ontological problem. At the heart of Indigenous epistemologies, we are all selves in relation. We do not exist because of our relations, we actually are our relations. How might Indigenous and subaltern ontologies offer alternative ways of understanding, of possibly healing some of our relations? So in the spirit of relationality, I leave you with the following food for discussion in our group. As political ecologists, to what extent do we carry a responsibility to combine academia and activism, particularly given the environmental crises that we currently face? Beyond merely publishing papers, how can we as researchers engage in environmental justice movements in more meaningful and non-appropriating ways? What hope might reside in decolonizing political ecology as a conceptual framework, methodology, and radical call to solidarity and action? Etni etnu gulat godon. Gihtu enan elmi etni, gihtu ohta vuotta. Chayet sami vuonna.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. Food for thought, and I'm sure we will be able to come back to what you want to show later on. Our third participant is Elin Valsdottir from the discipline of anthropology at the University of Iceland. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for this opportunity. So just in simple terms, my proposed research kind of aims to investigate or look closer at this kind of complex web of social, political, and ecological implications brought about by mineral extraction in Greenland. Now, the mining industry in Greenland has experienced significant growth in recent years. This is driven in part by climate change and also this global demand for rare earth minerals. However, obviously this raises kind of various questions about the social, political, and environmental impacts on the various stakeholders, both involved and impacted or affected by the mining industry. I think also for that reason, a political ecology framework kind of provides a lens to recognize the power relations, social inequalities, and ecological consequences that are inherent in resource extraction activities. So today I thought it would be kind of interesting to briefly discuss these two significant mining operations or projects in Greenland. So one of them is the Kvanefjeld mining project, and then also Blue Jay Mining's Dantas Illuminate project. And both of these projects or cases are documented in the Environmental Justice Atlas. So in regards to the Kvanefjeld mining project, which is currently at a halt, it was highly controversial and it experienced strong opposition from both local communities, international and local NGOs, as well as government parties in Greenland. And this mining project was backed by Australian and Chinese investors. So kind of one of the, the key points of contention revolved around the mining of uranium in Greenland. And I think just from this case is kind of interesting from an environmental justice standpoint, because it kind of highlights the importance of collective action and resistance in the face of environmental threats. It also kind of showcases the significance of considering social-political dimensions of mining projects, and also the role of indigenous communities in negotiating for their rights and decision-making. Moreover, obviously, uranium mining, with its associated risks and impacts, also disrupts the social metabolism by imposing detrimental effects on local livelihoods and ecosystems. Now, in regards to Blue Jay Mining's Dantes Illuminate project, so it's currently in its exploration phase at the moment. So kind of unlike the Quantifield project, the Dantes project is backed by the government in Greenland, and it has garnered significant support due to its potential economic benefits, such as job creation and infrastructure development. However, I also think it's kind of crucial to critically evaluate the project's environmental implications alongside its economic benefits. So we kind of must ensure that environmental concerns are adequately addressed in decision-making processes, and also that indigenous people have the right to make their own decisions about the use of their lands, territories, and resources. I think that Dantes project also kind of highlights, this interconnectedness of economic development, political aspiration, as well as environmental concerns in the context of Greenland. As Greenland kind of seeks greater autonomy and possible independence from Denmark, the mining industry here is seen as a potential avenue for economic growth and self-sustainability. So just in general, the mining growth or the mining industry in Greenland is a very multifaceted and nuanced issue. So it brings about both opportunities and challenges. So while it has the potential to stimulate economic growth and support Greenland's aspirations for independence, it also raises various concerns about the potential damage to sensitive Arctic ecosystems, the disruption of traditional livelihoods, and then also the displacement of local communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eline. Our fourth participant is Cheyenne Chok-Gosar. They are a PhD student at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation here at the University of Bergen. Please.
Thank you, Björn. Also, thank you so much, Professor Joan, for a generative talk. So, as Björn mentioned, my name is Cheyenne. I'm based at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation here at the University of Bergen. And I've been here for 2 years. For the past 4 years or so, I've been studying, broadly speaking, the implications of lower carbon energy transitions for the lived experiences of the citizenry, for agripastoral people, for indigenous people, and also the other than human. My first case that I wrote my master's thesis on was on the Fusen wind case, which is actually also on the Environmental Justice Atlas. Very briefly on these cases, there's 2 wind parks. One is Sturhaja, the other one Ruan. They are approximately 30% of the winter pasture of 2 Sami reindeer herding districts that use those areas. It's been, this Saturday marked 600 days since the Norwegian Supreme Court marked the license for that wind park invalid. So there were protests there as well. So this one thing, and I'll circle back to that in a second, but for the past couple of years, I've been studying the implications of solar energy transitions in Western India, in the state of Rajasthan. And I think the case is quite interesting, both because Rajasthan now has the largest energy expansion capacity in the country. The world's largest solar park is there, Budla Solar Park. But also, a lot of the land that is used for carrying out these projects are sacred lands. These are sacred groves, they have sacred trees, the Kejri tree, and also very delicate ecosystems that are used by, for example, the endangered great Indian bustard, of which only about 100 remain. And while these two cases are very different, together they also tell a story of struggle and hope. They shed a light on climate change mitigation, right, in our contemporary model of social life, to quote Arturo Escobar there. And one thing that we see take place is that these areas are essentially resource frontiers, right, that are being opened up for indirect or direct green so-called extractivism. And we can talk about, whether or not lower carbon energy infrastructures are, direct or indirect extractivism, but essentially what is happening is they're being transformed into commodity extraction frontiers, right? And the implications for this is that there is a huge land rush that you can actually look quantitatively on the global land matrix, on the appropriation, large-scale appropriation of land, 80% of which is in the global south, for projects that are justified under the language of green growth, of climate change mitigation, right, adding to kind of more historic discussions about developmentalism and growth and progress, right, that trumps these kind of place-based and alternative onto epistemologies. And while these lands are described as barren or empty or uncultivable or unused or wrongly used even, right? And that also says a lot about like who has the epistemic power of decide how is like whether the land is used correctly or not, and conflicts between different epistemologies. And I think academia's role here is quite interesting. I think it's also important to kind of think about how the implications of these, right, on agropastoral people, or to essentially, using Bjorn's work, also the lesser human in that way, and how people are transformed into that through these narratives. It makes these places immaterial when the people who use them. So what we're witnessing is the transferring of ownership and use rights of land, water, and air, and freedom into circuits of capital, right? The process of de-agrarianization. I think it helps to have this background when thinking about contemplating the role of environmental justice movements, right? With the emphasis here on S, with the plurality there, right? Because despite similarities, the struggles against the necropolitical implications, right, the politics of death, of these new mega machines and new mega projects are varied and diverse. And conceptualizing, for example, let's say energy justice in each context would have to come from the unique social arrangements, to cite Ivan Illich, of these various onto epistemologies. So I think thinking here about Sousa Santos and his term ecologies of diverse knowledges, right, that seeks to embrace this plurality is important in contributing to contemplating the role of environmental justice movements. To kind of end and kind of bring it all together, I think in response to ecological degradation, social fragmentation, and climate change, I think it's important to work and advance agrarian climate justice, right, as a form of environmentalism from below. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laima, Lisa, Eline, and Cheyenne for that, for all your excellent short interventions now. Now I leave the floor to Joan and Ksenia to...
I'll start and then you can...
Of course, yes.
Well, I think it's I'm going to focus on the comparative dimension that one could have with this. And in my experience, including my own when I was much younger, is that doctoral students can learn more from other doctoral students than from teachers. And they do this sometimes, but should be organized in this way. So what I recommend is that you send to each other your drafts of your chapters or your articles, and you get comments from one another, because you know different things, different geographies, but you are interested in political ecology, all of you, so that would be one byproduct of this meeting, isn't it? You have been selected just a little bit by chance, but now you are like a small team. If you keep together, you can learn from each other, because you can learn from each other about the commodities which are in play, for instance, ilmenite in northern Greenland for titanium, or the one that you didn't mention, that this mining project was stopped, but was mining of what?
Diamond prospecting.
Diamond.
Yes.
You see?
Yeah.
Diamond is interesting because it's a preciosity, to use various categories. So, although it's also an industrial mineral, but it's mostly for just the luxury good, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there is diamond mining also in some places in Russia, for instance, in other places around the world. But it's not, it doesn't fit very well with this social metabolic perspective that we do mining for industry or for capitalists. This diamond is just for luxury, isn't it? It's to make money, but also it's an industrial mineral. Well, I think it's important to explain the commodities which are in play, including wind energy, isn't it? Also, I think another thing I realized was that in Rajasthan, but also in the Arctic in general, you said this, there are few people, and what in colonial language would be called in India wastelands, isn't it? That the British thought this is wastelands. It's the only land they have, and they know what to do with it, and it's not waste at all, isn't it? It's the real land in the, so, but this thing that they are empty, relatively empty spaces, I think is also interesting, because for the resistance, isn't it? Compared in India, for instance, central India, with thousands of people going to demonstrations against coal mining, for instance. But in the Arctic, you cannot have demonstrations with thousands of people, isn't it? You have a few hundreds at most, isn't it? Except if you move to the cities, of course. So the density of the population is an aspect of all this. To the extent that now we're talking a lot about deep sea mining, which is another coming issue also in Scandinavia, in which there is nobody under the sea. Well, nobody, no human being under the sea, isn't it? Although there are, of course, implications about the whole biology. The other thing which occurred to me, because some of you mentioned my book, The Environmentalists of the Poor, and I'm going to do a self-critique, because many years ago already in Ecuador, somebody from ecological environmental groups, very good friends of mine, they told me, don't tell them poor. It's not environmentalists of the poor. People don't like to be called poor, although they are objectively poor. This is not quite true, because sometimes in history, I don't know, in Norway in the 20s or in the 1910s, whether the social question was seen as an opposition of poor and rich. Probably was more the working class and the bourgeoisie, perhaps in some kind of language, isn't it? So I've heard this in Spain many years ago, with the poor as a kind of reivindication, even as a joking relation, saying, we the poor, we eat very good meat every day, which was totally untrue, isn't it? And so that's to defend this definition of environmentalists of the poor that came partly from India, from Ramachandra Guha, studying the Chipko movement. And some people told me with totally reason that I should have said the environmentalists of the poor and indigenous. I mean, I think I said this yesterday already. In the Aldas, we have 40% of the cases involve indigenous people acting as indigenous, using their indigeneity in the struggles they have how this happens in Greenland, well, not in the north because there are so few people, isn't it? I don't know whether this would be one question for you, whether indigeneity, like the Sami populations in Scandinavia, this does not exist in the same way, perhaps, but it exists in Canada and exists in the Russian part of the Arctic. So one thing would be this, I would call it now environmentalists of the poor and the indigenous, or the environmental justice movement in general. Then another question which I thought would be interesting, and I would like your views, would be on what Laima Nomenaike said about the use in environmental movements. I am translating what you said now in other terms. The performativity of the iconography, to talk in Greek, the iconography, for instance, when there is a demonstration in any social movement, feminist movement, working class movement, agrarian movements, people do the demonstrations. I don't know when this was invented, but they show banners, and the banners have inscriptions now with the government or whatever they say. No? They could say perhaps land, water, air, and freedom in the next ones, or land and freedom, they could really say. So these banners, which are written in many languages, isn't it? And we have many of these, a collection in the Atlas, not made on purpose, but just came up doing the database entries, and we put some photographs as an illustration, but they're not an illustration. They are the main evidence, in a way. The main evidence is these banners that people are carrying with some inscriptions. But apart from banners, there are many other forms of art, of murals, for instance, that people paint in the cities, or there are films nowadays that it's much easier to make videos than it was before, and so on. So this also, I think, is useful for all of you to look at this, not just as old-fashioned anthropologists with a little notebook writing notes at night time, which like Malinowski did for many years. I don't know whether he did some drawings, probably he did some drawings also. But it's different from looking at the iconography as one of the main sort of pieces of evidence about the social movements that we are studying, and which we could be called the environmental justice movement, which is the main topic of the study in political ecology. So this is what I noted as sort of starting the discussion. And I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, I have a few notes. Yeah? Okay. Well, first
because you have been in some of these places, at least, in Finland.
Yes.
Good.
Not all, of course. So, yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your presentations and for your interventions that are very inspiring. And as Joan also mentioned before, and speaking for myself, I'm also here to learn from you. And I hope to comment on some of your interventions and with, let's say, some similarities that we have been, let's say, also observing while working with the Atlas and the extractivist issue around the Arctic. So, Laima, street art, and also what we have as a form, let's say, of mobilizations, no, in the Atlas. Art as a form of resistance, if you could also maybe would like to comment or open the dialogue later. How important it is to express something that cannot be expressed maybe in other ways, or messages that come from. And we also had a short talk before importance of art in explaining this cultural heritage and the meaning of, let's say, environment or part of it that people have been defending. No, maybe I was thinking that this could be an interesting conversation on that. Then we have Lisa. Thank you very much also for your intervention. And political ecology, decolonizing political ecology, and also, as you said, the diversity that the Arctic region is, and I very much agree on that. And when we started to work on the Arctic, also the approach that and I agree, it's very limited in a sense of only mapping or putting a point on the conflict, but all the important meanings behind this struggle and the history, what I have been reading also, and you mentioned to understand the Arctic is also to understand the history of colonization of the region. And often, as I mentioned yesterday, yesterday also like perceived as this empty space very often, and also how human and nature relationships are presented also as a divide, what is nature, what is wild, and where are the people that preserve that bonds, and also important bonds that are part of the struggle, as I understood in my work. When we look into the resistance, it's not only about biophysical transformation, as I understand it as well. It's not only about health issues, it's also how people relate to nature and defend nature, and history and religion and spiritualities that are part of this biophysical, let's say, transformation, if I'm not wrong, and decolonizing methodologies, which is an important task also in approach to political ecology and putting the marginal issues in the center of the analysis. And as we had also, I mentioned earlier, the seminar Edicta Indigenous Futures mentioned, and how important is the research and the approach we have in environmental justice and political ecology issues. I wanted to comment on that.
Thanks.
Yes. Yeah, and Greenland. Ellen? Yeah, thank you very much. So while working on the Arctic, we also observed that this climate change and opportunities, if you can comment on that, and you mentioned like how the government or corporations are saying that the climate change is actually an opportunity to extract the Arctic, and how controversial that is to perceive all these messages in the media, for example, that we found a lot when we worked with Joan and Marcus on also in green extractivism, and being, I think, in Greenland, what we read is also sustainable mining. Maybe if you can comment on that, like climate change issues and green mining, greening the mining and the opportunities. Yeah, thank you very much. Cheyenne, yeah, I think that the comparison of these two cases, what's going on with this transition and new project, and also energy transition with windmills and also solar energy, in that maybe you can comment on the size and land grab that was present in your intervention, and how actually also on the landscape level, I think that's the concept, maybe if I understood good, you work on, and pastoralism, and also human-nature relationship, and the relationship with the animal, with the co-creation of the landscape, and how this green extractivism or total extractivism influence those relationships.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to add something.
It's up to you.
Yeah?
No, I'll add something, because I think that in this kind of No, because you mentioned diamonds, and this, of course, I mean, one has to study reality as it is, isn't it? But I think that what we see, if we call about diamonds, it adds to this vision of the Arctic as a marginal place, isn't it? We could go about diamonds in some places around the world, including some places in Canada, for instance, also in the Arctic, in which adds to this vision of something which is marginal. I already talked about this yesterday. And this word marginal bothers me a lot, because when we look at the commodities which are in play in what these cases that you are talking about, they are not marginal. They are uranium. Rajasthan is famous for uranium experiments and exploding bombs, actually, some parts of Rajasthan. And also we talked yesterday about exporting coal from the Arctic to India. And of course, if we talk about the Arctic, we are talking about gas and oil all over the region. And then we are talking about ilmenite for titanium, but also rare earths and windmills, which are part of what Xenia just called now green extractivism. So we are talking a lot about energy. So among all of you, the only who is classified as his discipline, or their discipline, energy transformation, is Cheyenne, isn't it? But you are all into energy. I mean, you cannot live in the world without worrying about even food energy. What you described is the waste of food energy and protein and vitamins and so on, much beyond what we would need probably in this very region some centuries ago. People would not waste something which has been so difficult to get in the form of fish or in the form of vegetables or meat. Therefore, this idea of looking at the commodities, at the social metabolism, I think it remains useful to bring things into political ecology. But of course, this is not the end of it. There are many symbolic aspects, there are social aspects, and so on. But I think what I would recommend to you also is to forget your disciplines. And I don't know who forced you to put, or who. The best intentions, I'm sure. Xenia is classified as development studies because her institute in Helsinki is called like this. But we are post-development people. We don't like the word development for reasons that the post-development people have explained. We are not, at least myself, for sustainable development. The word development should be avoided, I think. Well, you could use it as a discipline to have a critical approach to development. And you are in cultural studies, but of course you know about proteins and calories and vitamins. This is your main topic in a way, or another way, and so on. So I think that we are all into metabolism, conflicts, and valuation languages, and symbolic aspects which I myself have left aside for a long time in my life, and still I'm not at all an expert, which is this question of the iconography, the art. We used this in our group for a long time, cultural expressions, which sounds very strange, but we are all the time doing cultural expressions, for instance. Whether, for instance, at Dicta in Barcelona, are we speaking Catalan, Spanish, English, what kind of, just starting any conversation means to have a cultural choice.
Yeah, but you usually use
good morning. Yes.
Yeah, usually use human geography because it means everything and nothing.
Yeah, yesterday was joking about the human geography and inhuman geography. Which is, okay, so that's up to them now, isn't it? That issue.
It's up to you. I think Ksenia and Joan, you can steer the discussion a bit, and I think Ksenia had specific comments to each of the PhD students. So maybe they should respond.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, of course.
So we open the debate, no?
Yes. Do it openly. If any of you now wants to reply or add.
Yes, please.
You can do it.
Sure, I can start. You were talking about like opportunities and challenges, right? So, I mean, it's really important to note that climate change is not uniform for indigenous groups. Like I said in my presentation, they see both opportunities and challenges. But actually, at the moment, the mining industry is quite small in Greenland, so there are only 2 active mines. However, there's huge potential up north, for instance, with the Dantes Illuminate project, which I spoke about also earlier. However, just logistically getting there is also difficult just due to infrastructure. You know, none of the political parties in Greenland are, you know, against mining per se, but they maybe have different views in, you know, in relation to the pace of mining, the size of the mines, and the location. And obviously, I think the most important thing to take into account are the, you know, indigenous knowledge and or practices of the people who live directly by the mining sites. So I think they should be very involved in the decision-making skills. However, due to climate change, you know, for these people in these rural, you know, rural communities, it's now becoming more difficult to hunt and fish and so forth. So these mining projects could also, you know, bring increased economic opportunities, as well as increased infrastructure in the areas. So it is very multifaceted in that sense. However, also if we think about it, you know, obviously a lot of these mining sites are, you know, backed by these global corporations. So what if they, you know, decide that the mine is not economically profitable? They might just upsize and leave. So that also obviously very much affects the local community who live right by the mining sites, because this means, you know, loss of employer, abandoned infrastructure, as well as, you know, just loss of economic opportunities and so forth. So like I said, I'm coming kind of from the subfield of anthropology of mining. So I'm not really looking at, in a sense, whether mining is good or bad. I'm more kind of looking at, you know, the processes of life kind of shaped in this mineral age. So,
yeah. Could go a little bit more into this question of the climate, the impact of climate change, because on the one hand, as Annie explained yesterday, it helps to explain the polar Silk Road, isn't it? The traffic in the Arctic and the new ports, which are now free the whole year round or many months more than before. This is one thing, and the other thing, it opens up territories like probably Northern Ireland, Northern Greenland, for titanium mining and so on. But also, as we know, what is happening sometimes is the pipelines in Russia, for instance, they break down because the permafrost is melting, and therefore they make it more difficult. This apart from the implications for the people who live there and for the non-humans who live there, isn't it? The melting and so on. So that's one question. The climate change in the Arctic, of course, there are lots of things being written about this, but this could be something even could be good for the theater, so to speak, for the cultural expressions, because I'm sure that living in the ice is something that people, of course, have learned. This would be one thing. And then the word that Seni introduced now, extractivism, I think also brings many of these things together. In Latin America, there is a big anti-extractivist school of people, of political ecologists, and they have insisted in this word, which means that things are being taken away without any kind of compensation, real compensation, or even, well, we had how you can compensate. What is the price, or how you can compensate for destroying your environment. So I don't know whether this is useful for you. And of course, some parts of the northern countries have lived from or they have prospered from extractivists. And in Canada, for instance, this was an economic theory of Harold Innis based on the staple theory of economic growth, isn't it? Well, none of you are economists, which is really good for the discussion, but helps the discussion. But Harold Innis was an economic historian in Canada who criticized this, but said Canada, could be Argentina, is prospering through extractivism, no? for export of raw materials. Well, and here one spends 2 or 3 days in Bergen and one learns about the exports of the stockfish or timber or so many things, and Norway prospered in some periods, so this was not so poor because they were exporting at cheap prices, no? What people probably thought were cheap prices, these raw materials. So this is another question. Is this bad always? Or you mentioned this, no? What kind of compensation? So extractivism is something that we could use, you could use, and also this issue of the climate change and the implications. So any or more responses from you?
Yeah.
I think that what you explained on Finland, she has some familiarity with this place also. So
there's so many interesting threads here. I maybe also because of your connection to Finland, I'll maybe pick up on the comment of categorizing very heterogeneous groups of people as poor or indigenous, marginal, these kinds of terms. I think it's very important to also look at successful mobilizations amongst these groups and the empowerment and the creativity that is coming out, for example, from indigenous communities. And this is why I appreciate the Environmental Justice Atlas so much. It's documenting all of these different cases where perhaps there become more of a conversation of what perhaps is working, and of course diversifying then strategies. The case in Finland, this was in 2015. You can imagine a small town of Otsioka, 500 people living in this municipality. It's northernmost Finland, Sápmi. And suddenly we hear that diamond prospecting has been approved. It comes like that. There's no community consultation, not to mention indigenous consultation. There was no process. Here you go, this is happening. Now, Otsioka, as the community that I know the most, is the most creative community that I have seen in terms of mobilizing against ongoing threats. It's never ending. My friends in Otsioka could never be here today. I'm in this space because they're fighting the fight right now, up north. So what the community did is that we organized 2 long walks to the area where this prospecting was planned. This prospecting was planned by Karelian Diamond Resources, which is in partnership with Rio Tinto. And this is where maybe indigenous methodologies can be useful for everyone. Community members started sharing stories as we were walking. Stories of ancestral stories, but also current knowledge about the ecology. 2 new species were discovered during that walk. It brought the community together. This was not just about indigenous community members. Everyone was a part of it. And actually, it created the movement, which is when you talk about grassroots environmental, it gives me hope when I see on the ground these kind of movements coming together. And maybe I'll just ask the question, there, when you're in that field work as a researcher, the question always becomes, how do I give back? And in my role, it was very humbling. I did the very tedious things of little translations, carrying people's books. I was not at the front line, but I think that is perhaps what's needed. We just offer what the community asks for in the time and place. And there are these, I think, boundaries between activism and academia, research, become beautifully blurred. And connections are made in a different kind of a way. So some ideas that came to mind from those those points there.
I think that one common thing in the others is that we have this space to say, I mean, the people filling in the case they have to say whether it's a success or a failure or a don't know in environmental justice. And there are successes, more or less 20% of the cases are deemed to be successes, and 50% failures, and 30% don't know. I'm very much in favor of the category don't know, because many are ambiguous. I mean, success for how long? Another mining firm will come prospecting, perhaps. But this is it. But on the other hand, that 20% or 18%, whatever, are successes, are deemed to be successes. This is good for a movement. A movement, for instance, let's say, student movement in the University of Bergen, they might mobilize every 10 years, perhaps, asking for, free food, perhaps, or free books in the past. And, well, if they always fail, there will be no need. No, it's very, not only sad, it shows that it's difficult for a movement to go on failure after failure, although this happens sometimes. Success is good for life and to keep going, isn't it? And therefore, I think it's a good idea to have put this thing in the others, which quite often correlates statistically with project cancel or project in moratorium and so on. So it's good. I don't know, in Rajasthan it's more difficult to confront the Indian government or the Suzlon. Is Suzlon the company there?
Yeah, it's for the wind turbines. But
Suzlon, I don't know how linked it is to the government or how powerful it is.
Yeah.
But there are also some successes. Well, I know the case in Gujarat, for instance, about windmills, and with Suzlon, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so,
I think, if I may,
Yes.
because windmill is something that you have also in common.
Yeah.
In two
That makes sense. Thinking about some of the various, both materially, but also ideas that have emerged, that we have talked about here. Is thinking about, how we talk about, for example, extractivism in terms of for transition materials, right? Green extractivism, essentially, of sorts, and also lower carbon energy rollout, how they essentially are a renewed form of justification for the appropriation of lands, right, for transfer of use rights and ownership. Like in the case of Fusen, I remember talking to a Sami reindeer herder who lived in the area, who essentially argued that, if you look back at history, this comes in a history of, you had cabin development, you had road development, you had, industrial uses of land, and whatever land that we have left, we really need. And also, thinking about the case in Rajasthan as well, how there are mines, there are military practice zones, as this is borderland, right? It's a frontier as well in that sense with Pakistan. So large tracts of land have been dedicated to military. And so how, again, the little land that is used is, again, without any process, really, in terms of having consultation with people. So we could kind of contextualize some of this in context of infrastructural colonialism or infrastructural politicalism. But we talked about compensation here. Joan, you brought it up, and I thought that was interesting because for example, in the case of Fusen, the courts originally had argued that the companies will have to give 90 million kroner in compensation to the reindeer herding district. But when I was talking about how they felt about this with the Sami reindeer herders, essentially said that we are being pressured or told to change practices that we haven't carried out traditionally ourselves, because that would require feeding pellets or potentially fencing, etc. That wasn't done in that area, and perhaps that should be a decision that is made by them. But also thinking about doing environmental impact assessments, how if you do community environmental impact assessments, you end up with different outcomes because the variables under which they're carried out are different. And this kind of comes, I will end this with a question of sorts, essentially, of the epistemic element, right? How like Walter Rodney talked about guerrilla intellectuals, or Walter Mignolo on epistemic disobedience. This also comes to a question of like activism and academic work, to use knowledge in the service of the marginalized, essentially of sorts, and how can academic space be used to advance environmentalism from below? Yeah.
Well, there is something perhaps you have also in common, this issue of compensation, in the meaning giving money to people. Probably this happens when they lose a case. In my experience, people say, we'll start saying we are indigenous people, convention 169 of ILO, which I don't know whether Finland has ratified, but Norway has. So using non-economic arguments, and at the end, if they lose, they say, well, at least give us some money, give us something, isn't it? Once they have lost. I don't know where this happened, for instance, in the Alta River case here in Norway. And so this compensation, what does it really mean? Yeah. Because it's not between equal dimensions. You are
exactly.
You are giving compensation across different value systems. There's one issue that you perhaps have also in common, and not only compensation for damages, but also perhaps incentives, money incentives, that economists believe very much on this, how you would prevent wastage of food by some kind of clever economic instrument. Have you thought about this? I don't know, for instance,
so we work
making the price of food much higher or something, or that you have a right to your minimum 8 megajoules per day, and everything above this you have to pay a triple price. Well, I'm joking, but because this is not very practical, but I mean, how would you, or is persuasion the main method to convince people to behave properly in this? Because it's a general phenomenon, wastage of food, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why we worked with a lot of different messages, and if we return to the discussion of the art, so art, I believe, is very powerful because it is easily can be communicated. People usually don't want to hear long talks or long serious talks. So when you are facing into the face, like, fish belong to people, like as in Vardø town was created a coastal schistoprøre, like a coast protest group. And we collaborated with, again, Pøbel, one of the known Norwegian artists. And he, in the middle of a center, he painted together with local people, like ressurser tilhører folket, so resources belong to people. And this became like a market, a branding of an activist group, this coast protest group. So we went together with all T-shirts with an arm fit, like what it belongs to people, painted by Pøbel. And we had several protests in front of government with that image. So we're playing like that. Well, for the case of in Bergen of a feast against hunger, so we work with different messages. So, and it's in itself, like, I think we all can do, and exactly, I think we need to detach ourselves from this, I'm scientist and this is indigenous, and so on, because we are all activists. And I think for me, this was the most important work I think I done, because it was before I started research. I had no intention of a generated scientific articles or to prove to anybody. It was pure idealism, and we were a group of people. We gather together, we work hard, and then we create something, and we created this art event because what people would enjoy. So at the end, during one day, we gathered 500,000 kroner. So it is an achievement, I believe so, and we donated to refugees of Syria, to Palestine, and we recreated. So we showed, we included social medias, regional channels, And what it made attractive, because as well it was music, it was sound, and gathering. It's like it became like, you know, like this meaningful through this art interventions and from doing together. So I think in general it's very problematic when this is what I agree with you. You know, what we are contributing when we are visiting people, because it's a very sensitive thing, and we are just visitors. So I think it's important to know what we are just visitors. Because, like, for example, in Vardø, and one research is done on some professor went to Vardø, and Vardø is like a boil of conflict, of different conflicts, of national states' exclusion of Sami groups and ethnical groups, of fishery policies that don't allow local people to fish, you know. So there are so many emotions there. And then go the professors who make 1 million krona per month, and when we say flaneur, we are doing flaneur walking. And flaneur, it is a tradition from 18th century, which was a man walk by a elitist man who had, a power and privilege. And now we are transforming the same method in a very sensitive society. So I think this is what needs to be like addressed, what kind of methods and method tradition we are using. Because one thing is of walking as we are approaching as just simple our everyday practice, and we're gathering, as you say, together, because it's not initiated by the scientists, which we will be now doing just this project, but it's initiated by a local group, and you are joining and walking and listening. So this is, I think, is important, with ethical issues of that, who we are, you know, and why we are putting ourselves so important position. Like we are humans, and we are like, in my thing, like if it is science to make matter, we need to be together and we need to create together.
Could I maybe pick up on one thought there? The idea and image that you, Professor Martinez-Alier, put in my mind at the very beginning of not many people being in the Arctic for these kinds of protests and campaigns. The fact that it's true in some communities there are more reindeer than inhabitants. We all know this who visited, for example, Sápmi. Now, putting those two ideas together, we, as we sit here, have a moment of political and environmental urgency. How do we create solidarity and support beyond Arctic communities, for example, who are organizing and mobilizing themselves? So for Arctic communities, we are the margin right here as we sit here in this university. It's totally flipped. Now, how do we bring, for example, protest art forms? So we were discussing this as we just met. There's Suah Panteror, it's this beautiful art collective. They have created a politicized map of Sápmi. And instead of empty landscapes, they have mapped out extractive industry developments, including diamond kind of mapping. It's a very powerful image. All of the place names are in Sami, which in itself is a political assertion. We were here, we are still here. Now imagine putting these kinds of images into downtown Helsinki, Helsinki, into Oslo. I think as academics and researchers, we also need to get more creative about how we step out and have these kinds of collaborations without, though, appropriating it from those whose lives are actually on a daily basis affected by what's happening, with the answer always coming back to the land. And in that way, again, I return to the environmental justice atlas. I think there's real creativity there. It's anybody can click, many of my friends do, to follow that mapping. So popularizing and bringing these kinds of urgent messages, I think, should be our priority.
Just to add on the Environmental Justice Atlas, I think also it's, you know, like you say, it's so important in terms of like cooperation and networking because it is a platform, it is a tool for, activists, academics, organizations, and so forth to share knowledge, strategies, common concerns, so it's so important, I think, in that aspect, as this kind of networking tool also, or organization tool,
Although there are other forms of communication, I mean, apart from saying we're going to do videos and so on, but there are some forms of action, well, marches, for instance. I don't know, in your march, whether you had television following you, or whether what kind of slogans you invented, or what kind of... But sometimes there is no repercussion in this sense, isn't it? Well, at least when movements start, the journalists arrive later always. And especially if there is some violence, but if not, they wouldn't even come. So, but there are other ways of showing what is happening, which we have not discussed, but which are relevant. I was thinking of Greenland, where, well, because I am Catalan, I'm very sensitive towards independence movements and even indigenous groups, although, of course, it's very different. But and I understand that in Greenland now there is an independence movement, although one could say there are few people in Greenland, isn't it?
There are 56,000.
Yeah, well, what does it mean few? What does it mean few? I mean, that's very paternalistic. There is one Catalan for every 1,000 people in the world, and we think, well, and that's enough. Too many or too little doesn't matter. This is what it is, isn't it? So, this one aspect, this communicates very strongly. If you see that Bougainville, for instance, in Australia, or Nouvelle-Calédonie for a question about nickel, but of course it's not only nickel, it's a colonial situation, are going to have independent referendums at some times. And this is happening, the geopolitics of environmental, of extractivism, is also interesting. I don't think it's the main thing. I think the main thing, as I said several times, is the grassroots movement, isn't it? But sometimes it has a kind of political connotation, not only about which political parties are in favor or against, but also in terms of this, a new country in the United Nations could become Greenland, isn't it? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is what you mentioned about environmental impact assessments, which go quite often together, or could go with recourse to the juridical branch of the government, to the courts, isn't it? For instance, well, you are famous in Norway because of the Rosenvosen wind farm, and the Supreme Court decided to stop it after it has been built already, because the courts work slowly, isn't it? And so that's one. But of course, this becomes world famous. The same thing as this other court case in Norway of children, I think, isn't it? Or grandfathers and children going to the court some years ago about climate change policies, isn't it? In which they also failed. Well, I don't know whether the Fosen wind farm should be catalogued as success or failure. I think it's don't know, because it has been built, but illegally, so to speak, isn't it? So these questions of making these conflicts communicate that these conflicts exist in a different way. Sometimes environmental impact assessments are purely rituals, and they are very badly done also technically, but it's a way, is a form of action, as we call it in the others. A form of mobilization is to complain about environment. And another is, and it happens very often in the others cases, is to go to the courts, which usually doesn't profit anybody, but sometimes it does, or at least makes for some publicity, isn't it? Well, it's a theater also, isn't it? It's a kind of performance going to the courts. And it's, well, in the others, I have, for instance, some cases in Japan, very interesting, which the lawyers come out of the court with banners, and we have won the case, and so on. And it's something, a ritual, apparently, in some places. That. So how do you feel about this, and how it feels, I mean, how it fits with what you do? Because in your case, you could expand this into different forms of expressions, well, I call it theater, which sounds a bit derogatory.
Yeah.
In India, of course, as Shishkotari and so on has been explaining for so long to other people outside, well, or here 1,000 years ago, or 800 years ago, people did street theater, isn't it? Because they did not have, the printing press was not yet invented, or they could not read. And so street theater is done in many villages in India and probably in other places in the world in this kind of conflict. But really street theater with, there is the bad people, the good people, the people in between, and the commodities are on show also. So this would be something that you could also advance a little bit on different forms of performances. Well, the university is a big theater, isn't it?
Yeah. I indeed wrote articles on theatrical performances of
you write articles on this?
Yes, exactly.
But you write yourself theater. You could write a piece of theater.
Yeah, very good idea. Probably next I do that.
The Pantagruel, the Gargantua Pantagruel theater about food waste.
Yes, of course. But I have a question, or like two questions, because like it was very curious for me. Like I wrote as well an article on a conflicts when generated from the unpredictable events like removal or repaintment. And my argument is that conflict is not always negative. It can generate a democratical platform out of that. So my question was, because you are mapping where conflicts are. So first question is, how do you define the conflict? And second question I would like to address is, in a matter for me, when it's a conflict, there is a concern. For me, in a way, it's the worst case scenario when we don't know, and conflicts are of the lands without people. So do you take in consideration, for example, as mapping this kind of environmental places where there is no conflict but is about to happen, like, extractions and
Well, with no, but I think that I'll give the word to Senia also, who has a great experience on entering cases in the others. But I think to answer the last question, we have different categories of conflict. Some we call latent, which is a fishy in the bad sense of fishy, because, I mean, how do we know that there is a conflict if the conflict is latent? But for instance, I give an example. If nowadays a company would say, we're going to start a nuclear power plant in Germany, we are sure that somebody is going to complain, isn't it? Or a new lignite mining in Germany. So then we would be, but we have latent, we have, I don't remember the names that we use, but from latent to very
high, visible,
violent, So this measures degrees of violence, so to speak, from latent, no violence yet, to street marches, to violent, meaning people killed, isn't it? So we have these different degrees in the others. On the rest that you said, well, I agree, is we only put in the others conflicts which have already appeared in the press or in blogs, which are public, for two reasons. We don't want to put people in trouble, to tell the police what is happening somewhere. But if the police already know, because it has appeared in the press or somebody, I'm talking about the police, but it's not only the police, it's the government, it's the companies. We don't want to to make visible secret things, but we want to make visible, more visible things which already have been reported in some way. And we have perhaps some cases in which some local people have said this is happening before appearing in the press. But the press nowadays, meaning the press, the websites and the media, the internet, reaches everywhere. This would have been much more difficult some years ago. Sometimes I call the web, the map is like an archive, similar to what happened in France before the revolution, in which the peasants were supposed to be writing to the king. This was called the Cahier de Doléances, no? Complain, this is happening, our landlord is abusing us, well, I mean, many. And this has been kept in the archives and has been very useful to do social history. Well, we do it much better with all little 6 pages, all well ordered in the web. I hope it won't disappear in some servers. I don't know where they are actually, but it's becoming like an archive that we cannot put everything updated because there are 4,000 cases. But it's not bad to have an archive for future social history of the growth of the environmental movement, or the environmental justice movement in the world, which in a few centuries is going to rule the earth. Or which is helping, I think, for a better world.
Yeah. Can I also ask a quick question?
Yes.
I was just, so in one of the readings for this masterclass, it was noted that the Environmental Justice Atlas is a way for the subaltern to speak. And I'm just kind of curious, how can a statistical tool let the subaltern speak, if that makes sense?
Well, yeah, I would say subaltern speaking is because of this famous, what is it called, Spivak? Because it's an interesting question, but it's more academic question. In India, there was somebody called Gua, also another Gua, Ranajit Gua, who died recently, and he started a school of social history, and he called it the School of Subaltern Studies, taking the word subaltern from Gramsci, writing in prison. I think he used subaltern thinking that was better from the point of view of the censorship or whatever, meaning the people, meaning the, well, we would call it the subaltern classes, no? This is very much used in Italy, and has come into social history as a term to describe, well, the subaltern, the poor or the powerless people, more the poor, the powerless people or social classes. And this is what they did in India, this group of historians, looking in Bengal especially, to social movements that old colonial history only look at what the British had done, or some forms of the mutiny, so to speak, of 1859, because it was a military uprising, but not the day-to-day forms of peasant resistance, as Jimmy Scott would call later. This is subaltern history. And then Spivak wrote a famous article saying, how do they know what the subaltern, and then he gives examples from her own family about women mainly, who had very complicated lives, to speak, to put it mildly, and they said nobody knows about what happened to my great-great-aunt with her marriage relationship, and she was suppressed by the family, because this is not in any document apart from perhaps. And he said the subaltern cannot speak, more or less. That's what he said, wrote, and became very famous. And I think it's true, but we should try to help this not to happen, isn't it? Because the subalterns speak a lot, but they speak through theater or to demonstrations or to, well, everyday forms of environmental resistance, perhaps some little sabotage or something, or sometimes declaring the independence of Bougainville, for instance, or perhaps of Greenland. So this really will be in the news, isn't it? And therefore, that's the debate. That's the reason to use the word subaltern. And it's true that I myself, I think I've written sometimes, that the atlas is a way for the subaltern to speak. Well, to speak is a metaphor because it's in writing. Everything is in writing with some videos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting discussion so far. We have promised to open up the floor to the audience, which we will do now. And we have someone, my esteemed colleague over there, walking around with a microphone. Is there anyone who would like to pose a question? Yes, we have one in front. And others can also give a sign to me. So state your name, and also, since we're a big group, you can maybe also say who you direct the question to. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contributions here and giving us small pictures from your research. And I think tomorrow maybe we will have for the Atlas maybe 8,000 small cases, because we know what's going on. But more and more we can see also there is a bigger picture, because we can collect all the stories and maybe we can find the same back curtain. But my question here is about this common line we can set up. Maybe we can talk about a new kind of colonialism also. And maybe we can focus more on what then to do. What about, you talked about solidarity, about international solidarity also, and there is a tendency coming up with information from all your research, and that's very useful with this information. But we have also organizations working for the NGOs working, you can say, top-down. So maybe we could collect more and more with this international solidarity. So you can talk for the public about your research, and we can collect it also in NGOs. Because maybe today we have to do also with a kind of a collective trauma, that in a way we know about these connections, global connections. We know about the bigger picture, but we have not the words, we have not made it with the right concepts, and we have not done it in the context, in the right context. So although we have all these small pictures from your research, then there is a bigger picture. And we need this international solidarity. And now again, it's 10 minutes to 12, or maybe 1 minute to 12. So it's very important now that you go out in the streets and tell about your research, and that you find your NGOs and you find your international solidarity together with huge NGOs.
Yes.
So that could be a small contribution from my side. Use your knowledge in an active way. Thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If we should clap. Yeah, that's
We have a question in the back as well. I think there was more of a comment and a call than a question. So let's take a question.
Hi, should I introduce myself?
Yes,
I'm
please.
Emma Lord from the Centre for the Study of Sciences and the Humanities. Thank you so much for this wonderful masterclass. It's been really fascinating to get further insights on the Environmental Justice Atlas, and it's just so great to see you here getting the recognition that you deserve for your work and your research group and all the people around the world that you're collaborating with. My question is more of a practical question, because I'm very interested in the point you raised about the marginal places. For example, the Arctic can often be viewed as a marginal place, but in terms of material flows, it's not marginal at all. You also mentioned the Amazon yesterday. What kind of data sources do we need to put, to recenter places that seem marginal but are actually not in terms of material flows? So how do we do it? What data do we need to include?
If I could just add to that, because I also had a question relating to that, to the panel. I was thinking about our models and the political economy of representation, for instance, of cartography, etc. So that would follow up on that. I mean, you asked about data sets, but also the larger picture of the political economy of the forms of visualization we use. So perhaps you would like to comment on that. Any one of you?
Go ahead.
You.
No, go ahead.
On this question of marginalization, I don't know exactly, because I criticize, in fact, I think it was you, Xenia
I
and
will
Rotot.
intervene after Joan.
They wrote an article saying the growth from the margins, and I know them very well, and they are very clever people, but I thought, why they are using this thing from the margins? And they were all women, or the group, I think, except for Georgians. And I said, well, for instance, when a feminist group would use marginality, they do it in an ironic way, isn't it? It's not that women think that they are marginal. It's not that they accept this kind of ontology, you would say, because they know, first, this is not true, assuming that I can use this word, and also it's self-defeating. If you put the same, it's self-defeating, except you can say, well, you'll see what happened with the margin, no? With the people who come to La Bastille, to put one example. They were the marginal people of Paris that took La Bastille. So they can be used in that sense. But I think that from another point of view of the material flows, for instance, the uranium in some places in India, or the uranium in Greenland, how come the idea of taking uranium from Greenland? Well, because it's going to be exported to some nuclear power plant and eventually to plutonium and to make some bomb somewhere from where it is. So it's not a marginal, it doesn't matter whether it's marginal. And you go there because people don't like uranium mining near their homes, isn't it? So it's a kind of imposed marginality. It's the same. The servants go to the kitchen. Well, but the servants sometimes don't like this, and perhaps one day will revolt, isn't it? So, or they should revolt, or will no longer exist as a class. Therefore, I think that marginality is something which I feel uncomfortable, because I see the geography, the geographical reason, depending on some representations, including the one we have in the map, that some people criticize it, say, you put the North much bigger than Africa, isn't it? And we know that we could reverse the map. In fact, we have a website called Reverse the Map, but I don't know how to do it and not to lose information. But it's true, it's true. These atlas that we showed, the one image that was in the screen some minutes ago, is one representation of the world in a map, which I don't remember how it's called, which is untrue to the reality of the surface of each continent, isn't it? That's why Greenland appears so big. Therefore, there is many questions about this. I have not answered the question. I have joined the question. I myself don't know what.
Could I maybe add a thought?
May I comment, since we are having this conversation since yesterday? So first of all, it was a thought and an argument. First of all these struggles are, let's say, everyday struggles, I would start with, not marginalized at all. These are strong and brave movements and people and women that are putting marginalized topics in the center of the discussion. And that was our point in the paper and we also refer to Farhana Sultana in that sense in political ecology. Gender issue, racism are very marginalized. So that was the point.
It was an ironic way of putting it.
Exactly, yes. And Brototi also had a comment yesterday. We were going, no. But I very much agree on the criticism on the marginalized. No, because it's not marginalized at all. So that was our point.
I think we can take a few more comments there, and then we have to round off. So, Lisa.
That's an interesting question. Maybe I'll just respond on a practical level of an anecdote that I know about, and that's the Indigenous Mapping Collective. And actually, that would be a beautiful partnership if it's not already with the Environmental Justice Atlas. But many of these so-called marginal communities are doing science, of course, all the time, and know their lands better than anyone else. The reason, for example, that we were able to withdraw, the mining exploration was kind of withdrawn and stopped, was because we documented evidence that this marginal area is so ecologically meaningful. The whole term of marginal becomes very absurd when we realize that 80% of the world's biodiversity is on indigenous lands, which are often classified as marginal lands. And suddenly everything is put into perspective. So luckily there are initiatives like the EJ Atlas, like the Indigenous Mapping Collective, of communities on a grassroots level collecting evidence. Perhaps not in ways that are deemed scientific enough, and there the subaltern question perhaps comes in, but of the environment to prove the ecological significance. So I would have maybe a look at that initiative as well. It's a pretty inspiring example of maybe what you're alluding to.
And there is another mapping, which will be the mapping of the centers of origin of the cultivated plants. So this is very anthropocenic, very human-directed kind of mapping, but nevertheless would show, well, we all know this, that you eat a lot of potatoes here in this country, it appears, and in the whole of Europe since the 18th century, or the time of Holberg, a little bit before, the potatoes arrived in Europe. Well, they didn't come from Europe, they came from
Peru.
Yeah. And the same thing with corn, with maize, and the same thing with rice, and so many things. So paella comes from the Arabs. So this map is very good. The origins of cultivated plants to show, for students, for instance, where the food, we say, where the food comes from? Well, it does not come from the supermarket. It comes from this kind of world exchange that there was.
So I think, would you like to add one more thing?
Yes.
Yes.
Going back from the margin, which is the paper, I just wanted to say that one also, let's say, message behind was that it comes from the margins means from the people themselves, how they show their struggles. So that was another point I wanted to add. Yeah.
Very good. Our time is sadly running out. We could have stayed here for a few more hours, I think, ruminating on all your interesting projects and their connections or disconnections or possible connections with the Environmental Justice Atlas. I would like to thank all of you here on stage. It's been very inspiring and thought-provoking, even for me as an anthropologist, Joan, since you think we know it all, we don't. This is something I have to admit.
You have to know everything.
Yeah. So thank you all for making this most exciting masterclass. Thank you all to the people in the audience and for those joining us online. Now, the program continues today here in the Aula. At 2 o'clock sharp, there will be the Holberg lecture given by the 2023 Holberg Laureate, Professor Joan Martinez-Alier. So please come back then and join me in giving those on the stage and yourself, actually, a round of applause.